So, with this lecture now, we are finally getting into the Civil War in Indian Territory. And I know that there are um, only minor battles in Indian Territory in terms of the larger narrative of the Civil War. Indian Territory is very, very small when you when you take into consideration what's actually happening in places like Georgia or as far north as Pennsylvania, or as far east as South Carolina and that sort of thing. But Indian Territory does play a role when you consider what's going on out west and when you consider what makes Indian Territory unique. Um, what I do want to make sure to emphasize here is that this is going to be a very short lecture, even in comparison to the previous two lectures, because most of the narrative and most of the information is going to come from the reading in the text from Main Street, Oklahoma, in that first chapter that we read. And so it is important for you to pay attention to the reading, pay attention to his argument. It is important that you keep those things in mind, that you take good notes. So I am going to go over some basic things here. I'll go over some highlights, but it will be up to you to make sure um, that you really pay attention to the reading and that you do a really good job there. So with that in mind, let's get into the Civil War by setting up the 1850s in Indian Territory. So when we talk about the 10 years of 1850 to 1860, um, the southeastern tribes in general, by the time we get to the 1850s, are in a much better place. You have a lot of the trauma starting to get to a place of healing. You've got much better and much more active economies. The Choctaw and the Chickasaw, for example, are dependent on a cotton plantation agriculture. You have the Cherokee, the Creek, and the Seminole, who they are all engaged in subsistence farming. They're engaged in ranching and cattle raising. They are all engaged in trade connections with New Orleans, and of course, New Orleans is important because of their ports. And New Orleans is also going to be important because it establishes a very strong relationship with the South, which of course is soon to be the Confederacy, right? So when we talk about these active economies, very early on in the 1850s itself, you see that the economies of the Southeastern Indians will establish a trade relationship with what will soon be the Confederate States of America. And that's how I'm going to refer to the Southerners, right? It'll be the United States and the Confederate States, and not necessarily the North versus the South, because the Confederacy had established themselves as, or at least tried to establish themselves as a sovereign nation. And so the Confederacy had, early on, even before declaring themselves an independent or sovereign nation, had established an economic relationship with these southeastern tribes. Each tribe had established a government. We've talked about that before. Um, they had defined the boundaries to their land. They all had their own sovereignty, right? They each had to deal with a representative. Um, from the United States so that the treaty obligations that they had each signed had been met, right? But in terms of the coming war, 14% of the population in Indian Territory, which by the 1850s, the population in Indian Territory had reached 100, at least 100,000 people. 14% of that population had been slaves, had been enslaved people, 14% of them. Future Cherokee Confederate General Stand Watie, he had owned 100 slaves. He was an immensely wealthy man. And you're going to hear more about him in this lecture. You're going to read about him in the chapter. Um, you know, in 1860, with the Republican victory and with, of course, Abraham Lincoln's presidential victory, Southeastern tribes actually were very nervous. They are incredibly nervous primarily because of the issue of slavery. Slavery is something that Southeastern tribes take very seriously. Slavery had become profitable to them, not because of anything else other than what it had done for them in terms of economic benefits. I mean, it was something that they had been able to um, do well with, right? It had been economically profitable to them for a lot of reasons. But even more so because of the rise to power of William Seward. So, William Seward, and I'm hoping that you remember this from your US history classes, but if not, look him up in your textbook that I am trusting that you have. In your US history textbook, there should be a reference to a man named William Seward, Seward. William Seward will become Secretary of State. Um, William Seward had long campaigned to take back Indian lands, had long campaigned to take back Indian territory and open it up to white settlement. Seward is a guy who is going to be listen, let me explain William Seward to you. Okay, so William Seward is incredibly passionate. He is someone who is going to, in fact, stand up to Abraham Lincoln a lot and say that Lincoln is not doing nearly enough against the Confederacy. He's not being angry enough. He's not being aggressive enough. So he and Lincoln are going to butt heads a lot. And Lincoln is going to go out of his way to say that Seward is the guy who is going to want to punish the Confederacy over and over again. So Seward is a bit of a hothead, and uh, so Seward has quite a bit. Uh, that makes the Southerners nervous anyway. And he has quite a bit of an agenda against against not just the Southeastern Indians, but anyone who is living in Indian territory. And so it is, you can see clearly why Southeastern Indians find reason to be nervous specifically about William Seward. So, with the Republican victory, they're nervous because of the question of slavery, because they do value their slaves. Slavery is something that they take very that they do take an issue with. It is something that they value, something that they do actually cherish. But even more importantly than that, they take issue and umbrage with William Seward. So when the war does finally come to uh, fruition, right? Both sides of the war, the Union and the Confederacy, do approach the Southeastern tribes in establishing alliances. Um, but not necessarily in the right way, right? The Union is not going to necessarily establish an alliance. They assume that Indian Territory is going to maintain itself because Indian Territory belongs to the Union anyway. So they're not going to go necessarily out of their way to beg for an alliance. And the Union is not necessarily going to bend over backwards to beg or appeal to any kind of loyalty that the native peoples might have. Keep in mind, the Union has a history of treating the southeastern tribes very poorly, going back to Indian removal since 1830. Right? I mean, the United States here is represented by guys like Andrew Jackson. So this is not going to go well for the United States. However, and let me just add on top of that, also have an issue here because every single military post in and around Indian Territory is abandoned, right? So Forts Washita, Arbuckle, Cobb, they are abandoned and they retreat to Kansas. Because there is an increase of Confederate activity in Arkansas. There's also, of course, naturally, Confederate activity in Texas because Texas secedes the Union. So, you can't, the Union presence leaves. And if the Union presence leaves, why should Southeastern tribes remain loyal to the Union? The Union wasn't loyal to the Southeastern tribes. So there is no need, at least the Southeastern tribes don't feel there's a need. Um, there's no need to feel any kind of loyalty. And so immediately, when we talk about how the tribes are approached, you're going to read about, and this is towards the middle of the chapter, you're going to read about a guy named Albert Pike. And Albert Pike is going to be a very important figure here when we talk about um, negotiating with the tribes. The Confederacy immediately sees potential in approaching the tribes. They see the potential in alliances with them, primarily over the issue of slavery, right? It's the reason why the Confederacy joined, it's the reason why the Confederacy is fighting the war anyway. It's over the issue of slavery. And of course, these tribes have slaves. So naturally, you have an ally in these tribes. But um, as the author points out, for the tribes, it's going to be about much more than that, right? As the author points out, it's not just about slavery. The Seward issue is going to bring out much more than just the issue of slavery. And so I want you to keep note of that. And, as soon as you realize and understand that, make note of it, underline it. And make sure you understand that, because that's incredibly important. It's not for the tribes, for the Confederates, it's about slavery. They're going to argue, and people since then will say states' rights, states' rights, states' rights. It's not about states' rights. The states' right that they want to preserve is slavery. But for Southeastern tribes, it's not just about slavery. It's about so much more than that. Um, and Albert Pike, who is pictured here, Albert Pike understands that, and there's a reason why the Confederacy chooses Albert Pike to represent them, to negotiate with them. And in fact, he will, as I list here, he approaches the Cherokees, the Creeks, the Choctaws, and the Chickasaws, and the Western tribes in negotiating with all of them, and meeting with all of them. And he seems to understand how to address all of them, how to meet with all of them. Now, do all of them respond to him in the same way? Absolutely not. They all will have different responses to them, responses to the Confederacy. They all will have different responses to how they will be able to serve the Confederacy. And this is where we get into complications, right? This is what the chapter will also get into. Now, when we talk about Southeastern tribes and having to choose sides, this is where things get a lot of this is where things get into a lot of muddied waters and a lot of complications, especially for guys like John Ross. John Ross will want to get into the issue of neutrality, but he realizes very quickly that it becomes very complicated because Kansas, which is to the north, is a Union state. Arkansas and Texas, which is immediately to the east and to the south, they're both a part of the Confederacy. So neutrality would require, extra careful diplomacy. It would still require military power, um, because, you would have to um, make sure that there is no sort of encroachment from either side. How do you make sure that the Union doesn't step in and try to take over? And how do you make sure that the Confederacy doesn't step in and try to take over? It's almost impossible. Honestly, it's very impossible because you are still in the United States and it is a civil war. And in the Civil War, and if you are on the outside looking in, it'd be one thing if you were outside of its borders, but you are inside of its borders. It's impossible to be neutral, right? So you have to choose a side. And what if you choose the losing side? That's the issue that John Ross in particular is going to have a problem with. Um, when we talk about choosing sides, the other thing that you need to be mindful of is what the Confederacy promises the Southeastern tribes if they join with the Confederacy and support the Confederacy during the war. Things like protecting the institution of slavery, right? Independence and territorial integrity. The Confederacy promises to continue on with the treaty obligations that these tribes signed. During the Indian removal process. Also, there's the promise that these tribes could send delegates to the Confederate Congress. So essentially, the Confederacy is offering than more of an equal status in a Confederate nation than the United States offered, right? So this is a much better deal than they ever would have gotten with the United States. So neutrality is impossible, and the Confederacy is offering something much better than what the United States would offer. So on the one hand, why would you even want to choose neutrality, especially when you have so much more to gain from the Confederacy, right? When we talk about choosing Confederacy, um, remember they've got a lot in common, and that commonality is going to be based on the fact that not only do they have a value in uh, slavery. They value the institution of slavery, the economic benefits of slavery, the belief that slavery has much to bring to them. They also value the promises of, you know, what is offered from both sides. And when I say both sides here, what I mean is that the Confederacy offers all of these things, right? The fact that you've got independence, like what I mean by independence is of course, native sovereignty as well as territorial integrity. But on the other side of it is the fact that these native peoples are promising warriors. They're promising, we will fight right alongside with you. We would fight to the very end, to the very last battle. Native peoples are willing to fight until the war is over and until the Confederacy is the last to stand, until the Confederacy has won its independence from the United States. That is the promise. So when we talk about what is promised here, in addition to all of the things that the Confederacy has promised, which we just talked about in the previous slide, the native peoples have basically all promised essentially to fight until this is over and until the Confederacy has won. And what's interesting here is that if you remember this from your Civil War class, is that you don't even get that kind of guarantee from men in the Confederacy, right? There are men in the Confederacy who are fighting and abandoning the war effort because they have to go back home and help with the farm. They are exhausted. Their families are dying of starvation, or they just don't want to fight anymore. Right? That's a huge problem for the Confederacy. So, in a lot of ways, in some instances, you have um, men in the Confederacy who are not showing the same level of commitment as some of these warriors uh, in the southeastern tribes. Um, so that's what's really interesting here. This alliance proves to be incredibly strong. So, in terms of actually fighting this war, one of the things that you want to keep in mind here is that Indian Territory, in terms of strategically, again, Indian Territory is not seen as this hugely significant um, place or hugely significant win, right, in terms of the narrative of the Civil War. It's really about what it could do in terms of control, or seen as a gateway towards the West. So either when we talk about Indian Territory, you have two men that are pretty significant here. For the Union, you have, oh, I don't know why it's that it looks that way, but General Winfield Scott and the Anaconda Plan, and for the Confederacy, it's Brigadier General Ben McCulloch. Um, so Winfield Scott's Anaconda Plan was a strategy to control the Mississippi River, and the Anaconda Plan was essentially using the Mississippi River to divide the Confederacy. Right? Um, if you can, and listen, this plan is really ambitious because of the size and um, the manpower it would take to try and um, to not only gain control of the Mississippi River, but then to maintain control of the Mississippi River and then divide the Confederacy. Um, McCulloch is going to um, essentially take control. So McCulloch here is in the bottom picture, and then Scott is in the top right. So McCulloch was given command of Indian Territory, and he was given control over three Indian regiments plus one regiment each from Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas. And so when we talk about his command in Indian Territory, there's also several groups assembled in Indian Territory that will include the Choctaws and the Chickasaws, known as the Mounted Rifles. They're under the command of Douglas Cooper, who is pictured in the black and white. And then there is the Creeks and the Seminoles, who are commanded by Daniel McIntosh, who is there in the sepia picture there on the bottom right. So here's the thing, all of these men, the Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creeks, and Seminoles, and then all of the men under the command of Ben McCulloch are all sort of commanded to take, to basically manage, control, protect Indian Territory. And you're going to read in that chapter how much control they have over Indian Territory, and how long that lasts, which isn't very long, to be fair. But what you're really going to find out is the real problem. And the real problem is that even with all of the Confederate promises, even with all of these beliefs that the Confederacy is going to bring in a better status, these ideas of delegates in their Congress and all of this stuff, um, there is a tremendous amount of division. Um, and this division is going to last the entirety of the war. It is going to result in a deep division that will sort of echo and resemble what happened prior to the 1850s, right? And that's the thing. During the 1850s, things had settled, things had gotten into a bit of a rhythm. They weren't completely unified, but you're getting there. And the war just unsettles everything. And it leads to absolute upheaval. And it's the most troubling for John Ross and the Cherokees, because John Ross, on the one hand, is going to, as you will read, side with the Confederacy at first and then switch it up and side with the Union. Meanwhile, Stand Watie, a slave owner, is going to rise the ranks and become a general for the Confederacy. Stand Watie is significant because his uncle was Major Ridge and his cousin was John Ridge. And those two names should sound familiar to you because those two men had signed the treaty that sent the Cherokees into Indian Territory in the first place, right? Stand Watie had managed to escape execution. He is, in terms of his military career, he had accepted a commission as a colonel in the Confederate States Army. He raised the 1st Regiment of the Cherokee Mounted Volunteers. And in August of 1862, he replaced John Ross as principal chief. And as you will read in the chapter, John Ross is really struggling here. So when he loses that position of principal chief, it's not easy. There's a lot of back and forth. So when Stand Watie becomes principal chief, it's not because, everybody loves Stand Watie. It's not because John Ross easily gives it up, right? So in May of 1864, Watie becomes brigadier general. And then in February of 1865, he's placed in command of the Indian Division of Indian Territory. But by February of 1865, the war had essentially been lost by then, right? And in June of 1865, he is the last Confederate general to surrender. Um, and in the meantime, over the course of the entire war, here's the thing: you have all of these other chiefs, John Ross, John Chupko, who is chief of the Seminole tribe, who are struggling with this idea of wanting to preserve unity, of wanting to stay out of somebody else's civil war. And then, of course, there's Apothala Yehola. Apothala Yehola, who, again, you will read about in the chapter, also struggles. He is chief of the Creek. He is seen as an older, wiser uh, chief, an older, wiser leader. Um, and it's important that you read about him as well, because his role is going to be incredibly important, and how they respond to him is going to be incredibly important as well. What I want you to understand about how they deal with these leaders is a question that um, I want you to sort of think about, right? Because when we talk about um, these struggles with um, the leaders of these particular, let me go back for a second, these particular tribes and wanting to maintain neutrality, the United States is not going to take these guys into consideration. But if you were them, you are going to want to take into consideration what it is they are wrestling with, right? Because in that moment, or during these years, if you're them, you're thinking, I'm just trying to preserve uh, my tribe's way of life, my tribe's sovereignty, as best as I possibly can. And that's nearly impossible, right? That's nearly impossible. Okay, so that takes me to the Battle of Pea Ridge, which is fought from March 7th through 8th of 1862. So this is when Indian Territory was used to force the Union out of Arkansas. So in other words, Indian Territory was used almost as a bridge of sorts. By now, Albert Pike, who again incredibly significant, Albert Pike had been promoted to brigadier general. Uh, Pike had led Indian regiments to drive out these Union troops. The Union troops at this point had been led by Brigadier General Samuel Curtis. And Curtis and the Union soldiers had defeated the Confederacy. Um, and when we talk about these fights, these defeats, it was pretty significant. And it was really frustrating for the Confederacy. So much so that the Brigadier General McCulloch, the Confederate Brigadier General who had been placed in charge of Indian Territory, he claimed that uh, his native soldiers were performing in a disorderly manner and scalping Union soldiers. Um, and so, what the truth is to that statement, we don't know. I'm not entirely sure. What we do know for sure was that McCulloch um, was playing into a lot of these assumptions and racist beliefs about Native peoples, and essentially had made these arguments about um, Native soldiers and Native peoples, and made these very racist statements, saying that they were, quote unquote, savages, that they were beasts, that they didn't know how to fight like civilized men, and that sort of thing. Albert Pike um, was absolutely offended by McCulloch's statements. Pike had argued that these were men who had fought honorably. These were men who we had asked to fight by our side. And now you are demeaning them. Now you are debasing them and calling them names and saying all of these terrible things about them. And so he took his regiments back to Indian Territory and he said, "You know what? We don't we don't need to be anywhere near or around a guy like McCulloch." I want to point out um, this particular incident because it takes me back. I'm going to go back a second. It takes me back to this particular issue about um, dividing the tribes for a second because I want to talk about um, the reason why um, these tribes are divided and what Ross, Chupko, and Apopla are arguing. What Ross and Chupko and Apopla will argue is, listen, this is their fight. This is between them. And at the end of the day, will it actually matter if they make these promises? Will they actually respect our humanity at the end of this? Will they, even at the end of the day, are they really going to um, abide by what they promise us? Will they see us as equals? You are going to read in that chapter, you are going to read about um, an incident where the Confederacy will, in late 1861, um, chase after Apotla and a group of Creeks and Seminoles, about 7,000 Creeks and Seminoles, um, who most historians know as Loyalists. Um, and the Confederacy, these particular Confederates, will be made up of Texan troops, but also Native American warriors. They'll be led by Douglas Cooper, and they will essentially chase after Apopla and these Creeks and Seminoles, 7,000 of them, chase after them because they declare loyalty to the old treaties and essentially want to maintain neutrality. They chase after them essentially to kill them, right? There are women and children among these 7,000 people, proving that, at the end of the day, these are people who don't necessarily see their humanity. The Confederacy doesn't necessarily see their humanity, and they just see these people as native people. And um during the chase, as you will read, it becomes quite problematic and very controversial for these native warriors among Douglas Cooper's group. And it's something for you to keep in mind, because while you can sign your alliance to the Confederacy, you have to ask yourself, as a Native American, is it really an alliance? What am I really allying myself with? What is it that I'm really fighting for? And that's the question. Um, when we talk about um, this whole, I'm gonna push past this for a second. When we talk about, yeah, we've talked about all this. When we talk about how this pushes on into Indian Territory, what the Union will do is the Union is going to call for um, a new attempt at trying to retake Indian Territory, and that will be through the Weir expedition. So, Colonel William Weir of the Union Army um, will unite with Apotheliahola's followers, excuse me. Apotheliahola's followers are in Kansas at this point. And Weir and his men will unite with Apotheliahola's men. Remember, they are members of the Creek and the Seminole. um, they are going to unite in Kansas and try to launch an invasion. Um, at that point, John Ross, and um, 2,000 of his men also try to join in um, with this group, and try to take over Indian Territory as well. Um, One of the things that you should know is that at this point, Albert Pike is so frustrated with the Confederacy, and with um, what the Union, or with what the Confederacy has been doing um, with the tribes in general, because he believes that the Confederacy has been discriminating against Indian troops, that Pike actually will resign his commission. And after he resigns his commission, he is arrested by Douglas Cooper. And so when we talk about um, the actual um, the legacy of Albert Pike, Pike will make a name for himself as someone who is able to negotiate with these tribes, um, and tries to defend the tribes, but it does not go well ultimately. Um, so when we talk about the continuing saga here, there is still quite a fight to go. So, led by General James Blunt, this is, of course, Brigadier General James Blunt, in October of 1862. He invades. He and his men invade Indian Territory from Arkansas, and this is, of course, him leading the Union Army. Um, and they defeat Douglas Cooper at Fort Wayne. And when we talk about what's important here, Colonel William Phillips, who will come in and be placed in charge of organizing a group known as the Cherokee Unionists. So these were men who were actually with John Ross, and they were loyal to the Union. So that will that will explain the Cherokee Unionists. In February of 1863, something is William Phillips will organize something known as the Cowskin Prairie Council, which is a fantastic name, just so you know my opinion on it. The Cowskin Prairie Council selected Thomas Pegg to serve as or work as the acting Cherokee principal chief. And he is selected, that Thomas Pegg, P-E-G-G. Thomas Pegg is selected because John Ross was, quite frankly, too controversial at that point, right? And so when Pegg is selected, it's essentially established primarily so that you could create a sense of stability. It's a new chapter, and the Cherokees could try to move on, right? By the next year, so 6 months later, you have the Battle of Honey Springs. Um, and when we talk about this new sort of momentum, uh, this is also, again, led by Colonel William Phillips. Um, the Union and Native allies are occupying Fort Gibson. You can see the image there on the right hand side. Um, Douglas Cooper will come back to gather 5,000 of his troops to attack the fort. But then, uh, while Phillips is overwhelmed by the 5,000 troops, he gets support coming in from Major James Blunt, who comes in from Kansas with 3,000 more men. The reason why this battle is important is that it demonstrates what the Confederacy is up against in the Indian Territory. What happens is that the Union demonstrates that it's willing to sort of reinforce its willingness to protect everything that it holds on to in the West, including Indian Territory, right? The thing is that the Confederacy believes or makes the assumption that Indian Territory is this waste of a space, that they're willing to ignore it, willing to dismiss it. And of course, a lot of this assumption is based on the idea that Seward wants to give up Indian Territory and give it to white people, or Indian Territory is given to Native peoples and nobody cares. It's this throwaway piece of land. But when the Union comes in willing to reinforce it, the reality is that when you talk about um, Indian Territory, it is seen as um, this gateway to the West, right? And so um, you have um, this extra willingness to protect it. Though the other thing that you've got to keep in mind here, we've talked about that. The other thing that you've got to keep in mind here is that after Honey Springs, um, the Confederacy has to figure out that there is this, that they've got to do whatever they can to stop Union progress. So they engage in guerrilla warfare, right? They give Native warriors permission to engage in guerrilla warfare, primarily to interrupt Union supply lines to Fort Gibson. The hope was that if they can interrupt supply lines, that they could eventually retake Fort Gibson. So you would have these roaming bands of irregulars who were robbed. Sometimes they would murder random civilians. Then, the other thing that would happen is that there were these retaliatory raids um, that would take place. Um, throughout that region in northeastern Indian Territory, where civilians were left incredibly vulnerable. So they were robbed or they were murdered, brutally murdered, and you had a massive refugee problem. 2,000 Cherokee had been displaced in Fort Scott, Kansas. And so when you had all of these people who had no home, who had nowhere to go, they didn't know where they were supposed to live after that. Plus, a lot of them had lost. Their men had gone off to war and had died in war. This is going to be a huge problem, and that's going to be a significant issue, right? Um, when we talk about, um, well, we talked about him. So when we talk about, um, why Indian Territory is going to be significant, this is going to be a real issue when you think about what's to come after the Civil War. So in your notes, put big stars by this, especially the massive refugee problem. This is going to be really problematic because it's not going to be just a native problem, it's also going to be a white American settler problem because they're not going to be settlers, they're going to be refugees. So, when we get to talk about how this all results in the end of the Civil War, what we have to talk about is what the Indian Territory looks like um, after the war is over. And of course, we'll get into that when we talk about Reconstruction, and Reconstruction specifically in the Indian Territory. Because one of the things that you need to know is that there's Reconstruction for the Confederacy, right? Um, but there's also a separate Reconstruction for Indian Territory. That's what you've got to keep in mind here. So there's Reconstruction for the Confederacy and Reconstruction for Indian Territory. So Indian Territory gets its own Reconstruction. Um, the alliance with the Confederacy, this is what you need to write down. The alliance with the Confederacy destroys everything that the Southeastern tribes had in Indian Territory. So all of the progress that the Southeastern tribes had made from 1830 up to 1860, all of that progress was gone. It had been all of the economic progress, all of the political progress, all of the social progress, that's gone. Any kind of goodwill created between the Southeastern tribes and the United States, that's gone. All of that has been destroyed. Um, that the moment these tribes established alliances with the Confederacy was the moment that they, meaning the Southeastern tribes, nullified their treaties with the United States. That's what you have to understand. The moment they signed their alliances with the Confederacy is the moment they nullified their treaties with the United States. That's how the United States government saw it. So essentially, these tribes are starting at square one. And do you think it's going to be a good place to start for them? No, absolutely not. So when we talk about um, what this is going to look like, actually, let me go back for a second before the economic loss. I said in the previous slide, I talked about refugees. Let me go ahead and talk about them now so that we don't forget it or lose sight of it. Around the Red River, so right all across this border, right here, uh, there are 15,000 Confederate civilians that have settled around that area, around that region, gathering there, settling there, and living in abject poverty. Okay. 15,000 of them have essentially settled there and lived there in abject poverty. 15,000 camps have been set up there. By 1863, um, one out of every three Cherokee married women, one out of every three Cherokee married women became widows. One out of every four Cherokee children were orphans. One out of every three Cherokee married women became widows, and one out of every four Cherokee children were orphans. That's how bad things were. Economically, when it comes to economic loss, a system had been created to supply federal troops as well as the refugees with meat and with other foodstuffs, um, which was fine, except looters had pillaged the herds of Indian Territory. Remember, at the beginning of the lecture, I had told you, and even a couple of lectures before, I had talked about how a few of the tribes had made their economic livelihood from cattle and sheep and all of that stuff. Looters had pillaged herds of Indian Territory and sold the livestock to contractors who marketed animals to the army at inflated prices. 300,000 head of cattle had been stolen from Indian Territory, which was a huge economic blow. 300,000 head of cattle. Um, and of course, there is a huge political loss. Kansas senators had worked to transfer Native peoples who had been living in Kansas into Indian Territory, and then abolish treaties that had been made with these southeastern tribes. There was one senator from Iowa, a guy named James Harlan, Harlan. James Harlan, he proposed a bill to end tribal sovereignty and establish a territorial government for a state of Oklahoma, um, and destroy all Indian land titles. And essentially, it was, you know what, screw it, get rid of tribal sovereignty, open it up to white settlement, and let's just get rid of it all. So when we talk about what um, essentially happens after the Civil War, it's all up in the air now, right? None of those removal treaties matter anymore, because moment they signed those, the minute they signed their alliances over to the Confederacy, their relationship with the United States had been changed forever. And that's what's going to set a new trend for the rest of their history with the United States.